This border ain't big enough for the two of us. Former President Donald Trump and President Joe Biden are both at the U.S. border with Mexico as immigration becomes one of the top priorities for Americans amidst an unprecedented wave of illegal immigration. The pair each blamed the other for the crisis at the border and pitched their solutions for how best to fix it. Trump vowed to enact, quote, the largest domestic deportation operation in American history if he makes his way back to the White House, while Biden mulls using executive authority to stem the tide of illegal immigrants. During a press conference flanked by members of the Border Patrol, Biden called on Trump to assist him in getting the seemingly DOA border bill passed. Let's listen.
I understand my predecessor's an eagle pass today. So here's what I would say to Mr. Trump. Instead of playing politics with this issue, instead of telling members of Congress to block this legislation, join me, or I'll join you in telling the Congress to pass this bipartisan border security bill. We can do it together. You know and I know it's the toughest, most efficient, most effective border security bill this country has ever seen. So instead of playing politics with the issue, why don't we just get together and get it done?
Meanwhile, former President Trump touched down and made his way to Eagle Pass, a particularly popular crossing point for illegal migrants. Trump briefly interacted with assembled supporters, saying that it was a dangerous situation at the border, but that it would get handled. So interesting that Biden had some Border Patrol members behind him there. The Border Patrol president, the union president, Brandon Judd, said that he was actually not invited to the president's visit and that he basically received no word that the president was even going until it was announced publicly. Instead, he stood behind former President Donald Trump during his visit. We also pointed out in the opener that Biden is considering executive action on immigration. This is probably the only good news I've heard on border security out of the Biden administration since he took office. According to Axios, he is considering enacting an executive order that would prohibit illegal immigrants from claiming asylum if they cross in between ports of entry, which is actually something that was first implemented under the Trump administration. And Biden at the time called it inhumane and not compassionate and got rid of it on his first day in office. So it's interesting that he's now considering that as we see immigration come to the top of voters' minds in the polls. So Jessica, what do you make of these competing border visits by Trump and Biden?
I think it's interesting to see just how the folks at the border are reacting. It's obviously, the fight we've just had between Border Patrol and the National Guard of Texas is a major tension. That's something that kind of fell along party lines when you had, the Border Patrol people saying that this was the Biden administration's decision, directing them, not supporting the state of Texas. So, of course, the tension's been along partisan lines for the most part there. Not surprising to hear Joe Biden say he wants to work on an immigration bill with Donald Trump. That rumor, I'm not sure if it's confirmed. He said that, I saw that it broke this morning. That would be absolutely wild. I think that would be another reason a lot of, longtime Democrats even would question supporting Joe Biden if he's willing to work with Donald Trump on the border, because what Biden should be doing right now is talking about how big fiscal policies have resulted in economic growth with the influx of workers we've had come from other countries. We've had 5.2 million workers join the workforce in 2023. About half of those are estimated to be immigrants coming into the United States. And the Congressional Budget Office, which has been very concerned with spending and the deficit and wants to make sure that, our balance sheet's looking good in America. But CBO estimates are that our economy grew $7 trillion thanks to this. And the vice president and senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas in Texas credited the growth in the economy to migrant workers coming in. They said, the economy couldn't have grown this much with just the native workforce. So it's really time for Biden to be talking about how much the economy grew, in part because of the fiscal investments made through the IRA, but also because of the influx of migrants. And the fact that he's not doing it is a sign of weakness. He should be pointing to his track record and saying, we can keep doing this moving forward. We've proven it works, and now it's time to scale up.
Yeah, I guess the problem would be that, a lot of people don't view economic growth in terms of GDP as the end-all be-all for determining immigration policy. As we have seen more workers come into the country, we've also seen massive deficits in housing availability. We've seen the inability of a lot of major cities, from Chicago to New York to, of course, cities along the southern border, being unable to deal with the massive influx and be able to provide resources to these people, let alone the many Americans who are struggling with homelessness and job loss who actually pay taxpayer money, or at least are citizens and should get the benefit of that before illegal immigrants who don't respect our laws coming across the border. And it's not just an economic consideration either, because we also have a massive national security issue that's coming with unfettered immigration. We've seen that people are actually now flying into Central and South America and making the journey on foot up with people from those regions, because they believe it's easier to get into the United States across the southern border than by going through the legal channels where they would be able to actually fly directly into the United States. Tens of thousands of Chinese nationals just since the start of the year, Russian nationals, as well as people from known terror hotbeds. There was one individual who came across the border 2 years ago and was allowed to roam the U.S. free until Border Patrol finally found him in the interior of the United States, who was on the terror watch list and had apparently had some kind of plans to bring some buddies over from wherever it was he was from. We've also seen some very tragic incidences in just the last couple of weeks. A dad was killed by an illegal immigrant who was drunk driving. A 2-year-old just killed in PG County, Maryland, by an individual who was a member of the MS-13 gang from El Salvador. He had 2 immigration detainers lodged against him in Montgomery County, Maryland, but because Montgomery County, Maryland is a sanctuary county, they did not cooperate with ICE, and so he was released from custody, went on to kill that 2-year-old. And of course, the tragic story of Laken Riley, who President Joe Biden has said absolutely nothing about. She was a nursing student at the University of Georgia, was killed by an illegal immigrant while she was out on a run. Same situation, where he had several priors in this country, and instead of being deported or prosecuted, he was released from detention without any cooperation from ICE, because his first offense was in New York City. His second was in Athens, Georgia, both sanctuary cities. So these are preventable situations, but we're not screening people who are coming across the border and making sure that they don't have criminal history or ill intent when they get here. So it's not just an economic consideration for a lot of people, but also a consideration about their living conditions, about the fact that their taxpayer money by the billions is going to help these NGOs to resettle migrants, while they don't really get the same level of support from their government, as well as the national security concern here with individuals being hurt, maimed, or killed by illegal immigrants who shouldn't have been here in the first place.
So I guess I'll start with the research coming out of Stanford, which thankfully shows that immigrants have about a 60% less likelihood of being incarcerated than people born within the United States. So they're 60% less likely to be incarcerated than people born in the U.S. So this idea that immigrants are, more so criminals than the people already in our country has really been disproven in the data. And when you point at certain examples and you describe them in detail, it does sound scary, but the data shows that that's really just not a concern. And when we look at immigration as a whole, we can't say, okay, there were a lot of people coming in and we're also experiencing a housing shortage. We can't confuse correlation with causation there, because what we've seen over the last 10 years is really the corporate capture of real estate. We've seen investors purchasing single family homes. There's currently, the Hedge Fund Homeowner Act introduced by Ro Khanna. I don't know if I'm getting that name right, but it's to address this precise problem, which has resulted in 15 million vacant units across the United States that are not filled. And then you have, in some cities, 60% of homes being purchased by investors, not by people who will purchase and live in that home. And so turning real estate into sort of a money-making scheme instead of, hey, this is a market for people to find a place to live, I would really credit as the chief problem with the housing shortage we're experiencing, or rather housing inaccessibility we're experiencing in the United States. And tax dollars, I think, going towards incarcerating migrants at the border, putting them in, detainment centers, is far more expensive than the alternative of saying we're going to create all of these economic incentives, right? Carrot rather than stick policies to say we're going to spur some economic growth so that these migrants have a role in our economy. They contribute to the productivity that makes, the economy better as a whole. The IRA ties this to a lot of, changes when it comes to energy, to make the United States more sustainable, to bring a lot of the energy production we have back home instead of overseas. That's a really good thing to have an influx of labor working towards, and it's something that will economically benefit the United States down the road tremendously. When we look at the current bill, H.R. 2, that's endorsed by a lot of the Republicans, especially those in Texas that have been very vocal. This is a bill that would impose $1,000 to $500 to $1,000 fines on anyone who makes a mistake in the process of applying for asylum. And if they can't afford that fine, they're put in prison. What's the tax drain on the United States there at that point? I think rather than deporting migrants, rather than detaining them, the better solution is to create, economic incentives in the economy so that there's really a home for these migrants, and it strengthens the U.S. economy down the road.
Yeah, we're running a little bit out of time, so I'll try to respond to your points as quickly as I can. But first, on the housing crisis, I agree that the housing crisis is 100% driven by other factors besides just migration. But it seems to me that if we are facing a housing shortage, the last thing we need to be doing is importing millions of people a year that are not American citizens to take what little availability we do have. Now, on the question of whether or not immigrants commit more or less crime, I would just start by saying, one, it's besides the point. The point is that illegal immigrants are not supposed to be here in the first place. It's easily preventable, these situations I'm talking about, because there's just the reality that you could have prevented it by not allowing them into the country or by properly screening the migrants who are coming. But on the issue of whether or not they do commit more crime, I'm happy to address that too. The study that you're talking about refers to all immigrants. There's only one study that actually refers to illegal immigrants versus native-born U.S. citizens. And that is a study that comes out of Texas, because Texas is the only state in the union that tracks any data on the incarceration of illegal immigrants. That study claims that illegal immigrants have a lower crime rate than native-born U.S. citizens, but the Center for Immigration Studies did a great breakdown of that Texas data that found that it's not an accurate interpretation. Why? Because the Texas data only counts as an illegal immigrant someone whose immigration status was known at the time of their arrest and booking. And the reality is that in our penal system, it's not often known someone's immigration status until well into their legal proceedings. So what the Center for Immigration Studies did is they actually went back and attached the proper immigration status to all of the people who were listed in that study. And they found that there was a lot more illegal immigrants that were incarcerated than were counted in the Texas study initially. And what the data ended up showing then, when everyone had the proper immigration status attached to their case, was that the crime rate among illegal immigrants was actually much higher, particularly even more significantly higher for violent crime like rape, murder, and other instances like that. So the data does show us that illegal immigrants do commit more crime than native U.S. citizens, not to mention the fact that, of course, they are committing a crime by crossing our border illegally. And I apologize that we don't have more time to get your response to that, Jessica, but I know we're going to continue to cover this immigration issue here on Rising.